Today, all eyes were locked on Capitol Hill as Pam Bondi stepped into the spotlight and faced the House Judiciary Committee. The room was tense. Lawmakers leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, and every word carried weight. It wasn't just another routine hearing. It felt charged. Questions came fast. The exchanges grew sharp. At moments, you could practically feel the temperature rise as members pressed her on key issues, refusing to let anything slide. Bondi held her ground, but the atmosphere, electric. There were pointed remarks, subtle jabs, and more than a few eyebrow-raising moments that had people whispering in the halls afterward. The kind of testimony that makes headlines before the gavel even falls.
Who gave the order to flag records related to President Trump?
To flag records for President Trump?
To flag any records which included his name.
I'm not going to discuss anything about that with you. I wish you loved Chicago as much as you hate President Trump. And currently, the National Guard are on the way to Chicago. If you're not going to protect your citizens, President Trump will.
That wasn't actually Pam Bondi up there. That was Saturday Night Live doing what SNL does best. But here's the kicker. The parody didn't feel that far off from reality. Because when Pam Bondi finally faced the House Judiciary Committee, she showed up with a playbook everyone in the room seemed to recognize. The strategy? Dodge, deflect, dismiss, anything, absolutely anything, except a straight answer. Lawmakers asked direct oversight questions, the kind that demand clarity. Instead, they got detours, long-winded pivots. And when that didn't work, the gloves came off. Sharp remarks, thinly veiled shots. At times, it felt less like testimony and more like a sparring match. But here's where it gets interesting. The House committee wasn't walking in blind. They had seen this movie before. They remembered her Senate Judiciary Committee appearance, the one where legitimate questions were met not with facts, but with a steady stream of insults aimed at Democratic senators. One by one, instead of engaging, she went on the offensive. This time, though, the room felt different, tighter, more calculated. Members appeared ready for the sidesteps, ready for the verbal jabs, ready for the performance.
Merrick Garland sat in this chair twice.
Mr. Chairman,
why
I have asked
didn't she ask Merrick Garland this? Didn't ask Merrick Garland anything about Epstein.
So this time, the House didn't walk in naive. They knew the rhythm, they knew the tells, they knew the routine. If Bondi was going to swing with insults and sidestep every direct question, they were ready to counterpunch. Not that it stopped her. The pattern unfolded almost on cue. A clear question would land, and instead of an answer, out came the pivot. Responsibility, redirected, accountability, reframed, ownership nowhere to be found. And then came the refrain, over and over again, like a chorus she wasn't about to abandon, Merrick Garland. Every tough moment seemed to circle back there. Pressed about decisions, Garland. Asked about oversight failures, Garland. Confronted with specifics, somehow, still Garland. It became the hearing's running theme, a steady drumbeat of blame, shifting that echoed through the chamber. Lawmakers tried to pin down specifics, tried to cut through the noise, but Bondi stuck to the script, deflect, redirect, repeat. By the end, it wasn't just a testimony. It felt like a tug of war over accountability, with the spotlight burning brighter each time she passed it somewhere else.
They said it couldn't be done in 4 years, yet President Trump has done it in 1 year. All the great things Donald Trump has done. There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. This has been the most transparent presidency.
Because whenever the questions edged too close for comfort, Pam Bondi seemed to pivot into something else entirely. Glowing praise for Donald Trump. The compliments flowed easily. Effusive, over the top, almost rehearsed. In the middle of pointed oversight questions, she would suddenly spotlight her boss's leadership, his strength, his record, a cascade of admiration that felt less like testimony and more like a loyalty audition. Critics watching couldn't help but notice the timing. Tough question, cue the flattery, pressure rising, insert glowing tribute. It became another rhythm in the hearing, dodge, redirect, praise, repeat. Whether strategic or instinctive, the pattern was unmistakable. The room might have been asking about accountability, but she made sure the spotlight kept drifting back to her boss, polished, protected, and thoroughly applauded.
The Dow is over $50,000. I don't know why you're laughing. You're a great stock trader, as I hear, Raskin. The Dow is over 50,000. right now. The S&P at almost 7,000. And the NASDAQ smashing records. Americans' 401ks and retirement savings are booming. That's what we should be talking about. We should be talking about making Americans safe. We should be talking about, what does a Dow have to do with anything? That's what they just asked. Are you kidding?
And then, just when you thought the detours couldn't get any more creative, came the Dow. Yes, the Dow. In the middle of pointed oversight questions with lawmakers pressing for specifics, somehow the conversation swerved into stock market territory. Pam Bondi began pointing to the Dow as if a rising ticker could substitute for a direct answer, as if market numbers floating across a screen were proof enough that everything under scrutiny was perfectly fine. It was one of those moments that made people blink, because the questions weren't about market performance. They weren't about Wall Street milestones. They were about accountability. Yet there she was, citing economic indicators like a shield, something shiny and impressive to hold up whenever the spotlight got a little too bright. For critics, it felt like the ultimate distraction play. When cornered, talk numbers. When pressed, pivot to prosperity. When specifics get uncomfortable, zoom out to the Dow and hope the glow of green arrows changes the subject.
To the survivors in the room, if you are willing, please stand. And if you are willing, please raise your hands if you have still not been able to meet with this Department of Justice. Will you turn to them now and apologize for what your Department of Justice has put them through with the absolutely unacceptable release of the Epstein files and their information?
Congresswoman, you sat before, Merrick Garland sat in this chair twice.
Attorney General Bondi,
No, can I finish my answer?
No, I'm going to reclaim my time because I asked you a
General,
specific question. This is not about anybody that came before you. It is about you taking responsibility for your Department of Justice.
Now let's rewind and walk through some of the most jaw-dropping moments. The highlights, depending on who you ask, or the lowlights. When she took her turn, the tone shifted. Calm, deliberate, but unmistakably pointed. Jayapal asked a simple, direct question. Were there victims sitting in that very hearing room? And the answer was yes. There were. It was one of those moments where the atmosphere changes. The abstract suddenly becomes personal. This wasn't just political theater anymore. Real people were present, real lives, real impact. The question hung there, heavy. Because once victims are acknowledged in the room, the stakes aren't theoretical. Every deflection feels sharper. Every dodge feels louder. Every pivot feels more obvious. Jayapal's line of questioning cut through the noise and brought the focus back to something concrete. Not the Dow, not partisan back and forth, not rehearsed praise, people. And you could feel the room absorb that shift.
How many of Epstein's co-conspirators have you indicted? How many perpetrators are you even investigating?
First, you showed it. I find it.
How many have you indicted?
Excuse me. I'm going to answer the question.
Answer my question.
No, I'm going to answer the question the way I want to answer the question.
No,
Your
you're going to answer the
theatrics are
question the way I
ridiculous.
asked it.
Chairman Jordan, I'm not going to get in the gutter with these people, but I'm going to answer the question.
How many have you indicted?
Again, the time belongs to
Reclaiming my time.
the time belongs.
I think it's very interesting.
Reclaiming my time.
I think it's very
Reclaiming my
interesting
time.
You can
that
reclaim
he
your
talks
time,
about
but
they
reclaiming my time,
indicted.
Mr.
The
Chairman.
president said they
Close the
indicted
clock.
him
Mr.
twice.
Chairman, please
They
stop the
sure
clock
did.
and stop the
he
clock and
indicted-
restore his time.
Okay, here we go with these
Committee will be in order.
theatrics.
When Pramila Jayapal pressed her, the response wasn't contrition, it wasn't clarity. Instead, Pam Bondi snapped back, accusing Jayapal of getting down in the gutter and staging theatrics. But here's the irony. If anyone was performing, critics say it wasn't Jayapal. There were no direct answers to the core question, no acknowledgement, no apology, no acceptance of responsibility, just another pivot, and right on cue, the familiar name surfaced again, Merrick Garland, invoked as if repeating it often enough might redirect the spotlight entirely. Then came a twist that made jaws drop. During Jayapal's questioning, a photograph taken by members of the press began circulating, and what it appeared to show was explosive. When members of Congress went to the Justice Department to review unredacted files, their search activity, the specific documents they were looking for, and was being logged, recorded, monitored. In other words, while lawmakers were trying to uncover what the Justice Department might be withholding, the department itself seemed to be tracking their investigative trail. Critics called it surveillance, an intrusion, an attempt to stay one step ahead of congressional oversight. If true, it raised serious questions about whether the very people tasked with accountability were themselves being watched, and the tension didn't ease from there. Another pivotal clash came when Jerry Nadler took his turn. Nadler, methodical and pointed, asked a straightforward question. How many individuals had actually been investigated or prosecuted by the Justice Department in connection with crimes against minors tied to this matter? It was the kind of question that demands a number, a fact, a measurable answer. What followed only added to the sense that this hearing was less about transparency and more about a battle over who controls the narrative.
And I told you about that, Attorney General, before you started.
You don't tell me
Yeah, oh, I
anything,
did tell you because we saw what you did in the Senate.
Loser, lawyer, not even a lawyer.
Committee will be in order.
So when Jerry Nadler tried to pin her down, calmly, methodically, just asking for a number, the response wasn't a number, it was an attack. Instead of answering how many people had actually been investigated or prosecuted, Pam Bondi went after Nadler himself. The question hung there, unanswered, while the exchange turned personal, and it didn't stop there. When Jamie Raskin entered the fray, things escalated even further. Bondi began questioning his legal credentials, his expertise, his authority to challenge her. That's when the hearing tipped from tense to surreal. Jamie Raskin, a former constitutional law professor, a longtime member of the Judiciary Committee, being lectured about legal qualifications by Bondi. The moment landed with a thud of disbelief. Instead of substance, it was swagger. Instead of facts, friction. Rather than providing clarity on investigations into serious crimes, the spotlight shifted to sparring over resumes. For viewers, it felt almost theatrical, a high-stakes oversight hearing morphing into a courtroom-style clash of egos. The questions were sharp, the answers were slippery, and when the pressure mounted, the counterattack became the defense. By that point, the pattern was unmistakable. Cornered on specifics, pivot to personality. Pressed for accountability, challenge the questioner, and keep the focus anywhere but on the numbers everyone was still waiting to hear.
You guys are disgusting, man. Hey, you guys are disgusting. I'm former law enforcement. You're disgusting. You are the Nazi. You are the Gestapo. You can't see it because you're chasing your pension, right? Your pension, your retirement, right? That's what runs your life, your retirement. The sad thing is they're not even going to get their pension because it's going to be worthless. And shame on you. Shame on you. Shame on you. Yeah. Fuck yeah.
The man in that video, the one who was in the police-worn body cam footage, the one allegedly yelling, "Kill him," at police officers on January 6th, his name is Jared Wise.
He does work for us.
He works for you at the Department of
he
Justice.
Does. He does.
This is an individual whom a federal grand jury indicted for 2 felonies and 4 misdemeanors related to his participation in the attack on January 6th. One of those charges was forcibly assaulting, resisting, opposing, impeding, intimidating, and interfering with police with the intent to commit another felony. This is who you choose as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States of America to hire at the Department of Justice.
I believe he was pardoned by President Trump.
Oh, he was pardoned.
Another revealing moment unfolded when Joe Neguse took his turn. Neguse didn't raise his voice, he didn't grandstand, he zeroed in. His focus? The people Pam Bondi has brought into the Justice Department under her watch, specifically several men seen in the now circulating video tied to the controversy. Who are they? What are their roles? What vetting was done? And why were they placed in positions of influence? It was the kind of line of questioning that shifts the spotlight from rhetoric to personnel, from speeches to staffing decisions, because who you hire says everything about how you intend to run an institution. As Neguse pressed for clarity about these individuals and their qualifications, the tension rose again. This wasn't about abstract blame shifting or the Dow or recycled talking points. This was about concrete choices, specific names, actual appointments, and once again, the hearing turned into a test of whether direct questions would finally produce direct answers, or whether the now familiar pattern of deflection would repeat itself.
Like former Prince Andrew, Donald Trump attended various parties with Jeffrey Epstein. I want to know, were there any underage girls at that party or at any party that Trump attended with Jeffrey Epstein?
This is so ridiculous, and that they are trying to deflect from all the great things Donald Trump has done. There is no evidence that Donald Trump has committed a crime. Everyone knows that. This has been the most transparent presidency.
And then came the answer that left people stunned. When pressed about one of the men in question, someone who had threatened police officers and faced charges tied to January 6th, Pam Bondi didn't deny it. She didn't distance herself. She defended it. Yes, he had been pardoned. Yes, he had been brought in. And that was that. For critics watching, it was breathtaking. A man accused of threatening law enforcement officers are now folded into the machinery of the Justice Department, the very institution tasked with upholding the rule of law. The symbolism alone was explosive. And the hearing didn't slow down. Another charged exchange erupted when Ted Lieu stepped in. Lieu turned the focus to footage involving Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, video that has circulated for years and continues to raise uncomfortable questions. The room tightened. Lieu asked directly about the footage, about what it showed, about whether it had been reviewed, about what responsibility, if any, flowed from it. And once again, the pattern reemerged. Instead of a clean, straightforward response, the conversation veered, context reframed, questions recast. The focus shifted away from the substance and towards safer ground. By this point, the hearing felt less like fact-finding and more like trench warfare. Every question a probe, every answer a maneuver. And with each exchange, the divide between accountability and allegiance seemed to grow sharper.
Because I believe you just lied under oath. There is ample evidence in the Epstein file.
Don't you ever accuse me of a crime.
I believe you just lied under oath, and this is all on videotape. You said there's no evidence of a crime. I'm showing you, here is a witness statement who called into the FBI's Threat Operations Center. He drove Donald Trump around in a limo. He overheard what Donald Trump said to Jeffrey on his cell phone. He was so angry, he was gonna stop the limo and hurt Donald Trump. And he met a girl who said she was raped by Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein. She later had her head blown off, and officers at the scene said that could not have been suicide. And as we sit here today, there are over 1,000 sex trafficking victims, and you have not held a single man accountable. Shame on you. If you had any decency, you would resign right after this hearing concludes.
Then came the moment that really crackled. Ted Lieu didn't dance around it. After the evasions, the pivots, the carefully sidestepped answers, he essentially said what many critics had been thinking all hearing long, that Pam Bondi was not telling the truth. You could feel the air shift. Bondi responded with immediate indignation. The familiar play, wounded tone, sharp rebuttal, posture of offense. The kind of outrage that suggests the real violation wasn't the alleged falsehood. It was the audacity of calling it out. But Lieu didn't flinch. He stayed measured, precise, calm in the face of the blowback. Rather than getting dragged into a shouting match, he stuck to the record, pointing back to prior statements and inconsistencies. It was controlled, strategic, almost clinical. The contrast was striking. On one side, heated protestations. On the other, steady insistence on facts. And in that split-screen moment, the hearing distilled down to its core tension. Performance versus proof, indignation versus documentation. For viewers, it was one of the clearest snapshots of the day, not just because of what was said, but because of how it was handled.
Who's responsible? Are you able to track who in your organization made this massive failure and released the victims' names? Are you able to track who it was that obscured Les Wexner's name as a co-conspirator in an FBI document? Do you have that kind of accountability?
I believe Wexner's name was listed more than 4,000 times.
Yeah, I already told you that. This is where he's listed as a co-conspirator.
Can I finish my answer?
Now, if you thought every tough question came from Democrats, think again. Because one of the more surprising moments of the hearing came from the Republican side of the aisle. Thomas Massie, hardly known for marching in lockstep, stepped forward and did something few expected. He pushed back. Massie, one of the authors behind the discharge petition and legislation aimed at forcing the release of the Epstein files, made it clear this wasn't just partisan sparring. For him, this was about transparency and about the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. He didn't frame it as a democratic grievance. He framed it as a moral obligation. Why hadn't more information been released? Why were there delays? Why did it feel like the Justice Department was guarding the files instead of opening them? When Pam Bondi responded, the tension was different this time. It wasn't opposition party versus administration. It was a member of her own broader political coalition demanding answers. And that shift mattered. Because when criticism crosses party lines, it's harder to dismiss as political theater. It becomes something else, a signal that the frustration over the handling of the Epstein files isn't confined to one side of the aisle. For a hearing defined by deflection and confrontation, Massey's exchange stood out for a different reason. It suggested that accountability, at least in this case, might not fit neatly into partisan boxes.
Yes or no, has the Justice Department asked Secretary Lutnick about his ties to Epstein?
Excuse me. Secretary Lutnick has addressed those ties himself.
I'm asking you, has the Justice Department specifically asked Secretary Lutnick about his ties to Jeffrey Epstein?
He has addressed those ties himself.
The hearing zeroed in on the Epstein files, how they've been handled, what's been withheld, and why the public still feels like it's getting fragments instead of facts. Lawmakers pressed Pam Bondi over inconsistencies in prior statements and the broader transparency issues surrounding materials connected to Jeffrey Epstein. Then another name entered the spotlight, Howard Lutnick. Members asked about Lutnick's reported ties to Epstein and public statements he's made minimizing or denying the extent of that relationship. The question was straightforward. What does the Justice Department know, and how is it handling those representations? Bondi's response followed a now familiar pattern. Instead of addressing Lutnick directly, she zoomed out. Broader talking points, process talk, generalities about ongoing reviews, emphasis on procedure rather than specifics. The name that had just been raised seemed to fade into abstraction. It was another moment where the substance of the question and the substance of the answer didn't quite meet. For critics, it reinforced the larger theme of the day. When confronted with pointed inquiries about individuals tied to Epstein, the responses drifted into safe, non-committal territory. No concrete clarifications, no decisive distancing, just a careful glide away from the center of the controversy. And in a hearing defined by sharp questions and slippery answers, that glide did not go unnoticed. When questions arose about Howard Lutnick and what his past associations with Jeffrey Epstein might actually signify, the response wasn't a firm denial or a clear accounting. Instead, it became a semantic exercise. What do ties really mean? What counts as a relationship? How should proximity be defined? But to many watching, that parsing of language missed the larger point. The concern wasn't just technical definitions. It was whether there was any appetite inside this administration to examine its own circle, its own connections, its own potential exposure, especially when those connections trace back to a convicted trafficker of minors. The answer, critics argue, seemed clear: look outward, not inward. And while the hearing centered, rightly, on the Epstein files, there was another flashpoint that may prove just as consequential. Under Pam Bondi's leadership, the Justice Department reportedly attempted to indict 6 members of Congress over statements that members of the military are not required to follow unlawful orders, and in fact have a duty to refuse them. That principle isn't fringe. It's foundational to military law and constitutional governance. Yet for articulating it, those lawmakers were allegedly targeted. If true, that moves beyond deflection or partisan spin. It touches on something far more serious: whether prosecutorial power is being used to intimidate or silence political opposition. For many, that would represent not just overreach, but a fundamental breach of democratic norms. Critics call it weaponization, an abuse of authority, a line that should never be crossed. And here's the political reality: if oversight doesn't happen now, it may happen later. Power shifts, majorities change, and investigations that stall in one Congress can roar back in the next. That's why hearings like this matter, not just for what's revealed, but for what's resisted. We started these nightly breakdowns to spotlight the moments that define a day or a week in public life, to unpack what happened, why it matters, and what accountability might look like going forward. Sometimes that includes cultural parallels, sometimes sharp exchanges, sometimes uncomfortable truths. If there are scenes, cinematic or otherwise, that capture the drama of these moments, share them. Because if today proved anything, it's that reality on Capitol Hill can rival any script. And thanks for staying engaged.